Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the workshop, Courageous Conversations in Times of Pandemic and Polarization, here at the Ignatian Family Teach-In. I am delighted to be with you. I know for me, Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice is one of my favorite conferences every year, and I hope you have gotten a lot out of it this week, this weekend, and have learned some new things and been challenged. As we get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Karen Bortford-Estrada. I work for the Maryknoll Lay Missioners. In case you forget, I have a little brand placement here to help you remember where I work. And we are here today to dive in to talk more about courageous conversations. Before we get started, though, I want to help us just arrive in this space. We are definitely living in a time where there's a lot of stress, there's a lot going on, and things are coming hard and fast, at least for me as well. So I invite you to take a moment to just return to yourself. We're going to use a technique I know is box breathing. You may have heard of a different name for this, but basically what we're going to do is you breathe in for 4 counts, you hold it for 4 counts, you breathe out for 4 counts, hold your lungs empty for 4 counts, and you're just going to go sort of in a box with that breathing. So we'll do it together a couple times, and then I'll let you just do some deep breaths on your own as we center and get ready for our workshop. So we're going to start by breathing in 4, hold it, breathe out, hold it, breathe in, hold it, breathe out. So I hope that has also helped you to get a little more centered as we come into this space. When we're talking about courageous conversations, it's going to bring up a lot of emotion usually for us. When we're entering into conversations, it brings up a lot of emotion. So if we can remember to go back to the breath, calm ourselves down, it can help us as we're entering into these conversations and dialogues and exchanges with other people. I want to give you a little bit more of an introduction to who I am. I think it's important when we enter into conversations to have an understanding of the space which we occupy and the perspectives and identities that we hold. So to give you an example of what this looks like, my name is Karen Bortford-Estrada, as I mentioned. I am a white, straight, cisgender woman. I am a wife, a sister, a daughter, an aunt, mother to a Latinx teenager. I am an ENTJ on the Myers-Briggs, a 6 on the Enneagram, a giver, a highly sensitive person, a vegetarian runner, global citizen. I am hearing. I do not live with a disability. I'm an Oregonian by birth, but currently am a Maryland resident. I'm a US citizen. I was born and raised Catholic. I'm a political science graduate. I've lived at the US-Mexico border, as well as overseas, and prior to COVID-19, I was a road warrior, as they call it. I would visit about 15 states in the US per year. I'm a millennial morning person, polygot. I am also a 3rd-generation immigrant on my mom's side. I strive to be a listener, an ally, a learner, facilitator, and an influencer. I also am a non-Indigenous settler and want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Indigenous land, which was taken and from which I continue to benefit. I would like to acknowledge the Piscataway people on whose land I live in Maryland and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So if some of my identities I just shared might conflict with some of yours or might make you a little uncomfortable, I'd encourage you to go back to the breathing. Just breathe it out. As I mentioned, when we enter these conversations, we are all coming to them from a certain place. We are carrying all of those identities with us. They're the lenses through which we see the world. There's the ways in which we engage with others. They might be some of our triggers. They might bring the worst out in us. Some of the identities I've shared are positive, and I'm proud of many of them. Some of them are not necessarily positive and might be a little problematic. Some of them will place me in positions of real privilege in certain spaces. Others, maybe not so much, depending on the space. But it's important we acknowledge all of the identities, regardless of how they're seen by the world or how we feel about them. I like to give sort of one caveat when I'm doing this presentation, which is it's important for all of us to understand our own identities so that we can assess what is or is not a safe space for us. For me, there's a difference, I think, between what is a safe space, physically, mentally, and emotionally, because all those things factor in, and what is an uncomfortable place. Courageous conversations are probably going to be uncomfortable. They're taking us to the edge of our comfort zone where things might get a little uncomfortable. We're stretching, we're growing as a human being. That's very different than being unsafe or putting ourselves in an unsafe position physically, mentally, or emotionally. And that looks different for all of us depending on our identities, depending on the complex traumas we might carry because of some of our identities. So it's important that we make those assessments when we're entering into conversations. And that's part of why I share some of my identities with you. So if I'm encouraging us to engage in these conversations and to keep engaging, that's in my mind if it's physically, mentally, and emotionally safe for us. Like I said, this looks different for each of us, and it could change over time. So there are spaces that I would feel emotionally safe entering into maybe 6 months ago. And maybe because of things that have happened in the world or happened in my life in the last 6 months, I no longer feel emotionally safe entering those spaces. That's okay. Things can change. A couple of examples just to really highlight this. There have been situations before where I am with friends who are of mixed immigration status, or maybe their families are of mixed immigration status. And someone else, not knowing this, will make a negative comment about immigrants. As a US citizen in those spaces, if I speak up, it's probably going to be uncomfortable. And it's likely that whatever this person said made me uncomfortable, but it's not a threat to my safety in any way. Whereas if my friend, who perhaps is undocumented, speaks up, it could be compromising to their safety for many reasons. Likewise, I've been in situations, religious settings, with friends who I know identify as LGBTQIA, somewhere on that spectrum. And a negative comment is said about people who have that identity. For me to speak up as someone who identifies as straight, there's no risk to my safety. There aren't going to be there aren't big ramifications for that necessarily. Whereas if my friend speaks up, they might be exposing an identity they didn't want to expose. Things might be questioned. It could compromise their employment. There's all sorts of different factors they have to weigh because that's one of their identities. So that's what I mean by assessing, is it safe physically, mentally, and emotionally, and acknowledging that that looks different for us depending on the identities we hold. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, feel free to use the chat. We're going to be using that throughout. So just, put your comments there, and I will be on the other side of that chat responding back to you. As we dive into this, what is it we're talking about, right? Let's go to the slides. So we're looking at courageous conversations. For me, why I come to this work is really because I have loved ones, family members, friends that oftentimes fall both sides of, those major ravines, those big divides of polarizations that we have in the world today. And I really think it's through these conversations and these individual actions that we can start to build a bridge. That doesn't mean we're going to bring someone to our side. It means there's a space where we can meet in the middle and we can exchange, and we can hopefully start to bring ourselves closer together and create more unity instead of the massive divisions we see, I think, especially in our country, but globally at this point. As we come to these conversations, I think for me and for many folks I've talked to, there's this desire of, how am I going to convince this person that they're wrong, or how am I going to change their perspectives? And so I like to offer this as we are opening. Rarely will we change a mind. We can only hope to soften a heart. So what does that mean? We're not going to go in, I'm not going to teach you all these debating skills as to how you bring someone to your opinion. It is very difficult to change someone's mind, and it becomes even more difficult if we don't already have a relationship with them. I don't know about you, but my perspectives usually don't change when a complete stranger comes up to me and tells me that I'm wrong, or when somebody starts coming at me. That's not what changed my mind. It's those encounters, it's those experiences that start to really soften my heart to a different perspective. And then it might change my views on any given issue. The other piece that I want to highlight here is that, you know, it comes from this quote: we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. Again, a lot of times what I have seen and experienced when we're going into these conversations that might be heated is we go in wanting to tell the other side how to see something, wanting to get our point across, wanting to make sure we're representing what we need to represent. But if we're not holding the space and listening to what the other side says, we might not fully understand where they're coming from. You know, I think of some of the hot button issues in our country today. One that always comes to mind is abortion. It's a very controversial issue. But the reasons that people hold for either supporting or opposing abortion vary drastically. So if I'm not listening and I go in and try to have a conversation with someone about that issue, but I don't understand why they hold their belief, it's much more difficult for us to have a dialogue, right? Because I'm putting all of these assumptions on them as opposed to listening and trying to understand and seeing where we have common ground. So far we've got, you know, the importance of staying calm. Keep doing your square breathing if this is raising things up for you. The importance of listening and holding that space for others and trying to understand where they're coming from. I think this is important because if we think of the world sort of as like this woven garment, right? We all have different threads in it. And as we are weaving together in this world, we can't really decide, like, I'm just going to leave this thread out. I'm going to leave these people out. I'm just going to cut them out completely. That's not an option. We are this interconnected human family. So we have to figure out how to, you know, we might not always agree, we might not like what everybody thinks, but we have to figure out how we can weave ourselves together into this garment that is our shared humanity. I think of each of us really as one of these threads. So, you know, I don't know what color your thread is, what the texture is, what it looks like. We all bring different things. And within each of those threads, there are individual strands. For me, those individual strands are the identities, there are beliefs, there are perspectives. They're some of those things that I named at the very beginning here. And I think it's important that we understand what those are, because sometimes it's those identities or perspectives where we're rubbing up against someone. Even if we're very similar, we might have, you know, one different strand in our thread, and that's going to be where, you know, we have a little bit of disagreement or a lot of bit of disagreement, depending on who it is we're talking about. So I want to give you all an opportunity to dive into what are some of those strands that you hold. Again, I think it's important that we acknowledge those identities, because when we're going into these conversations, you know, let's say there's 2 people in the conversation, we only control one side of that. We only control our side. So if we understand our own identities, it'll help us to better engage with someone else's. So this is what we're going to do with this fancy technology we have. We're not able to actually talk to one another, but we're going to do an activity called Who Are You? And the way this is going to work is I will say to you, who are you? And you're going to respond, I am, and an identity you hold. There's no wrong answers here because it's your identities, and you can assess what is safe for you to share or what you're comfortable sharing. I'm going to ask you to dig into that courage if you feel able to, and put that in the chat box. So each time I ask you, who are you? In the chat box, you're going to put I am and one of your identities. If you're not comfortable putting it in the chat box, just write it down on a piece of paper as we go through. And I'm going to keep asking you, because we want to sort of peel back those layers. We want to see all those identities that you're carrying, because I'm sure you have a backpack of, you know, 20, 30, 40, 100 of them, even if you don't acknowledge them on a regular basis. Okay, so we're going to try this chat thing out. Are you ready? Who are you? Who are you? I encourage you to keep putting a different identity in the chat each time I ask, and watch that chat, see what's coming up for other people. Maybe you have some overlap with some of those. Maybe some identities are coming up that sort of make you get that feeling where the shoulders go up. So just breathe through that. Who are you? 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 I invite you to take a breath. Maybe that was challenging for some people. Maybe you've never had to think of all the identities you carry. For others, it might have been easier. I ask you now to put in the chat, what was one of the first identities that came up for you, if you're willing to share? Some of us are privileged in the sense that we really get to decide what are the primary identities that we put forth in the world. How is it that we want people to see us? Which are those first lenses that we get to see the world through? Others of us are forced by the world to sort of hold one identity at the forefront, or that's an identity by which we're judged immediately. You know, power and privilege dynamics make all of that up. But I think it's important that we acknowledge, you know, what are those first few identities that come up for us? Because those are probably some of the identities through which we are first processing experiences. It also might depend on the situation. I know for me, I don't think much about my identity as a daughter, but you put me in a room with my parents and I'm automatically going to switch into that identity role. So again, understanding these can help us know the ground we're standing on when we enter into these conversations. I would also like to put forward here that just like we have many different identities, so do the people with which we're engaging in courageous conversations. And by limiting someone to just one identity, we're robbing them of their humanity. So they might have one identity that makes us want to scream. But if we are seeing them only as Karen the daughter, we're not seeing all of Karen's other identities. Daughter's probably not a particularly controversial one. I'll let you fill those in your head. But it's important that we acknowledge those we're encountering are also multifaceted, they're multidimensional, and I think most importantly, our identities, really, many of them can change and they can shift. We forget this, I think, a lot with parents, maybe with, you know, notable figures, with politicians. Identities can change, and ideally we're all shifting and evolving over time. So just because we had a conversation with someone previously and it went a certain way doesn't mean it's going to go that way again. Doesn't mean we can't find some common identities to overlap with. I'm going to invite us now to another activity. When we are thinking about these conversations, it's important to understand what's happening within ourselves and where we're coming from, what we're bringing into that conversation. I think it's very easy to put all the conflict on the other side and to not acknowledge what we're contributing to that divide. So I'm going to invite you to think about this question. If you had to name the identity, belief, or perspective, so we're widening it from just identities here, you would have the most trouble sitting and having a dialogue with, who would that be and why? So why is that the other that you most fear? For some of you, I'm guessing as you saw this question, automatically someone popped into your mind. Maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's someone you've encountered on social media, maybe it's someone you've seen in the news. An identity or belief perspective that you'd have trouble sitting down across the table or side by side, going for a walk with them, going for a hike with them, and having a conversation. Again, if something didn't pop into your mind, think about social media, think about the news, think about relatives that you maybe haven't called in the last few months or haven't interacted with because you don't want to go there. There's probably an identity, belief, or perspective that you've got a little bit of fear around. Maybe it's not fear, maybe it's anger, maybe it's anxiety. As you think about how you'd answer this question, I'm going to encourage you to use a blank piece of paper if you have one, and at the top, put I would fear and name what that identity, belief, or perspective is. And then I'm going to have you sort of write in a spiral, and I'm going to ask you why. Why is that you have some, strong emotion around engaging with that perspective? So you'll put because, and then you'll write your response. I'm going to encourage you to do this. You'll see I'm very high tech here in sort of a spiral, because you're spiraling deeper into yourself and your own understanding. You'll also probably notice because of the lighting that I like to recycle paper, because you can see the text on the other side. Recycle, reduce, reuse, folks. So as you're doing your spiral, I would fear, name who that is, or that identity, perspective, and belief, and then because. In your because, if you start putting a lot of they, them, they think, they believe, I want you to catch yourself and pull that back. We're very good at making assumptions about the other side, whatever that might be. I don't think we need a training course on that. I want you to be looking at what's happening inside of you. So if I would fear sitting down with a certain person, why? Because my experiences, because my encounters, because my studies have taught me that, that's counter what I believe in. Then I'm going to ask you, tell me more. And I want you to put another because and go deeper into yourself. Where is that belief coming from for you? Okay? So first, what is it that you would fear, perspective, belief, or identity you'd fear sitting down with? Why? Working around your spiral. Tell me more. And again, I ask you to tell me more. Go a little bit deeper. Tell me more. I would encourage you to, after the workshop, finish your spiral. Keep going deeper, keep telling me more, keep adding those because, until you get to a point where you can see for yourself, where is that strong emotion coming from? I was just speaking with a friend yesterday and we were talking about how it's much easier for us to come out against something. It's more difficult, rhetorically speaking, for us to stand for what we believe in. So if we can work to go deeper and understand ourselves, it will help us when we're engaging with someone else. Now, in the chat box, I would invite you to put what feelings, emotions, or changes did you notice in your body? What was coming up as you were being forced to sort of go deeper into yourself and think about your own fears, anxieties, strong emotions over a perspective? Maybe you forgot to breathe. I always encounter our non-breathers out there who just, hold their breath when these difficult conversations are coming up, or they start to think deeply. Maybe your shoulders went up. Maybe your stomach started to do this churning thing. Encourage you to go back to that square breathing. Remind yourself that you are safe. This is a workshop. You were just uncomfortable because you're having to touch something maybe that you haven't had to touch. But you're going to be okay. You can do scary things, whatever it takes. So again, I have us dive into this exercise, first to recognize what's going on in us, and hopefully also to remind us to have empathy for others. If we are talking to someone and trying to understand their beliefs, perhaps they have never actually had someone ask them questions that drag them below sound bites to really think about where their beliefs come from. It's not the way our world tends to be working anymore. So acknowledge within yourself when you're going into these conversations, you are already prepared now. You know what emotions and things might be coming up. You can remind yourself, I'm just uncomfortable. It's going to be okay. And also recognize that in the other person. The last piece that I want to add here as we are wrapping up is the idea about, where do we go with these conversations and what do we do? This is a picture of some of my cousins. On one side of my family, there were about 20, my grandmother had about 20 grandchildren, and we've all gotten, or a lot of us have gotten married or partnered up, and many have had children, so you know how this works. The numbers have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. We are a fairly disparate bunch. I named in the identities, I'm a vegetarian. I have a cousin who's a cattle rancher. So that one's a fairly easy difference. There are some that are a little more challenging, differences of perspectives. Why do I bring up my cousins here? Because this ties to this idea of cultivating connection over correction when we're having these courageous conversations. Again, you can't change a mind, but oftentimes we go in with the idea of I have to correct, they're doing all of these things that are just wrong and they don't have the right information. And that's many times how we'll go into one of these conversations. If we can step back and remember to cultivate that connection over correction, it can help bring us over that bridge to at least have a dialogue and at least keep us in contact over that, scary ravine of polarization that exists. I also put my cousins up here because I think it's important that we remember to take care of our own. There are some people who are able to go out and, talk to folks that are far outside their own comfort zone. I think of, people like Dia Khan, Valerie Kaur. These are some leaders who really step far outside their comfort zones into spaces where they probably aren't safe in the interest of having these dialogues. That's not what we're all called to do. It's just within those who are closest to us, how do we continue to build those bridges? I look at it this way. If we each have 10 identities, right? Those who are our own might differ with us on 1 or 2 identities, but we still have 8 identities that are the same, or we still have 9 identities that are the same. That gives us space to find those similarities, acknowledge each other's humanity, and have discussions around that 1 or those 2 differences of perspective, those differences of identity. If I'm going up to someone and we have just 1 identity that overlaps, and these other ones are all mismatched, we all have different perspectives, it's going to be much harder to have that connection. I want to tell you one very brief story about this. I have an aunt who came up to me one day. She knows I had worked with immigrants, and she said, what is it with, in the news, this is her language, not mine, all of these illegals, is it really that hard for somebody to come here the right way? As an immigrant advocate, my shoulders went up, I felt the stomach start to churn, and had to remind myself to exhale. Okay, we're focusing on connection here. And so I answered her question. Throughout the answer to her question, trying to explain some facets of the US migration system, because, that's a college class, that's an entire degree, not something I can do in 10 minutes, but explaining a little bit. I kept using different language, and I kept saying people who are undocumented, people who are in this country without papers. I didn't use her language. At the end, she said to me, I noticed you kept saying undocumented. You didn't say, you never used the word illegal. Or is that we're not supposed to use that word? That's what I hear in the news. And this opened up a small window for us to continue that conversation. Had I come in with the correction, everything she just said that made me uncomfortable, we probably never would have gotten there. But with focusing on the connection, it allowed us to create that dialogue and have that conversation. As we wrap up, I want to leave you this one little piece. We like to see results. I think it's how a lot of us have been trained. Remind yourself that success is achieved simply by having this conversation. If you reach out to someone who has a different perspective across that ravine, you are successful in that pursuit. That was a successful, courageous conversation. You probably didn't change their mind, but you engaged, and that's something we really need more of in our world today. Thank you for being with us. If you have questions, concerns, please drop them in the comments. I will stick around. You can also find me at the Maryknoll Missioners and Orbis Books virtual booth. If you'd like to know more about these presentations on Courageous Conversations, you can go to wishyouknew.net. That's sort of the other side of my life. With Maryknoll, we are doing a free book drawing, so I'd encourage you to come and enter. You can win one of these great books, learn more about the work of the Maryknoll Lay Missioners, global ministry. We have election guides, all sorts of things at our booth. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much, and peace be with you. Good luck in all of your courageous conversations.